Howdy, it's Kyle talking about some interesting natural features and locations in the US. With a country as large as this, there are bound to be all kinds of areas with beautiful geology and landforms that are visible. We have swamps and caves and mountains and deserts, and the variety of things you might see is quite large. And here I want to highlight a handful of beautiful areas. A couple of these, including the very first one, are fairly well known, but I mainly want to highlight places that aren't very well known outside of that region. So let's take a look at some interesting natural features and locations in the US. The first place I want to discuss is Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. This is the longest cave in the world. It's currently known to have about 430 miles of passage. That's almost 700 kilometers. It became a national park in 1941, and there have been many expeditions into the cave to push new passage and map new areas of the cave that no one has ever explored. And when I say it's about 430 miles, it doesn't mean it's one long path of 430 miles. It's an interconnected web of paths that adds up to 430 miles. It's very much a large maze. Some are large areas, big caverns. Some are little tiny squeezes that only a real small person can fit through. And to put that in perspective, you can go on a 6-hour expedition tour at the national park and you cover about 2 miles. What Mammoth Cave is, and what most caves are, is a limestone solutional cave. Limestone is made up of calcium carbonate, and when calcium carbonate comes into contact with water, or H2O, it creates a carbonic acid which slowly erodes away some of the limestone, and you might get random erosion here and there, so you'll get some big passage, a huge cavern you can walk through, or a tiny little hole that only air can blow through. There are many entrances to the cave, including the main one that most of tourists go through, but there are also vertical entrances, including Cedar Sink, which is just a big vertical sinkhole entrance. And as a region, central and eastern Kentucky, central and eastern Tennessee is one of the top caving areas in the entire world. There are 15,000 or so caves between the two states, including, again, Mammoth Cave, the largest cave in the entire world. The next location I want to discuss is the Hoh Rainforest, located within Olympic National Park in Washington. The Olympic Peninsula is that large peninsula across the Puget Sound from Seattle, and a good chunk of it is Olympic National Park, which is mostly known for its big high mountains and its beautiful coastal areas, but right in the middle of it is the Hoh Rainforest. When most people think of the word rainforest, they think of tropical rainforest, but this one here is a temperate rainforest. In general, the description of a rainforest is an area with continuous tree canopy that's so wet you can't really have wildfires there. And this Hoh Rainforest is in fact one of the wettest parts of the entire contiguous US. It averages about 130 inches or about 3,300 millimeters of rain per year, with about 87 inches or 2,200 millimeters coming just between November and March. In January alone, there are 25 inches or 630 millimeters of rain. And like many of the other forested areas along the west coast, it's known for having huge trees. But it's probably just as well known for how many mosses and lichens call the rainforest home. One of the main trails in the park is called the Hall of Mosses Trail, and there are no color filters on these images. This is how green it looks there. As far as I know, there's nowhere else quite like this in the contiguous US, and maybe not even in Alaska either, but this is a beautiful temperate rainforest, the Hoh Rainforest in northwest Washington. Heading over to the Midwest to a much smaller site, it's Toadstool Geologic Park in northwest Nebraska. This is located in the Oglala National Grasslands at the south end of the Badlands area of the western Dakotas. You might be familiar with Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and this is just across the border in Nebraska in the same general geologic region. And Badlands, what they are dry, higher elevations that are eroded to the lower spots. It looks like they might be mountains pushed together with tectonic forces, but no, they are erosional remnants. The park is called Toadstool Geologic Park because some of the rock formations look kind of like toadstools, and what this is a resistant layer of sandstone sitting over more easily eroded clay and mudstone beneath it, so it eventually topples over once the base gets too thin. But what the park is mostly known for is having many dinosaur and other prehistoric animals fossilized. One of the main sites at the park is the Hudson-Mang Bison Bone Bed. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bed of bones. It's the remains of well over 100 bison piled up into one spot. And these bones have been radiocarbon dated to be about 10,000 years old. So this is probably some type of a dangerous spot for bison, maybe a slippery slope where they fell down and couldn't get out and just died at the bottom of whatever this was. This is just a very pretty spot. You wouldn't expect to find something like this in Nebraska, but again, when you look at the map and you see how close it is to Badlands National Park and the Black Hills in South Dakota, it does make sense. So in case you're thinking Nebraska is just cornfields and sandhills, well, check out Toadstool Geologic Park. Heading down to the southwest, I'm going to Coral Pink Sand Dunes in Utah. This is a state park, but it's located right in the middle of a bunch of national parks, so this is often missed, and these dunes are much less visited than the Great Sand Dunes in Colorado or the White Sand Dunes in New Mexico. The park is about 5.5 square miles or about 14 square kilometers, and as the name implies, it's home to many sand dunes. Some are coral pink colored. The sand dunes are comprised of sediment from pink and red-hued sandstone common in the southwestern U.S. So you think about some of the famous formations in the southwest, most notably the Grand Canyon. Many of it is kind of a red color, and when some of it gets eroded, gets down to sand particles, can form up into dunes, and they can be coral pink sand dunes. These dunes can shift about 50 feet or about 15 meters per year, and they were formed about 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Some of the park is open to off-road vehicles and motorcycles, but most of the park is off-limits to vehicles, but you can go sandboarding. So if you want to check out a beautiful natural spot that's lightly visited in the middle of an area that's heavily visited, then check out the Coral Pink Sand Dunes in Utah. Heading back east, I'm going to the Dolly Sods in West Virginia. This is located in the Allegheny Mountains of eastern West Virginia in the Monongahela National Forest. It's about the western end of the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. The elevation of this area is between about 2,500 and 4,700 feet. It's the highest plateau in the eastern U.S. The area commonly referred to as Dolly Sods is about 27 square miles or about 70 square kilometers. And how it got its name, it is named after an immigrant whose last name was Dolly, and the sods are just an open meadow found on hillsides. It's very similar to the term bald, which is used in Georgia and other parts of the South. And what this area is most known for is having a unique microclimate that is much more reminiscent of something you might find much farther north, like up in Canada. Many of the plants and mosses and lichens are ones you find much more likely up in Canada or even in Alaska. Because of the topography, you can have rapidly forming clouds and fog. It can go from blue skies to almost zero visibility nearly instantly. And normally you would expect to see a lot more trees in an area like this, which is a humid climate and an alpine area. You think of the Great Smoky Mountains down in Tennessee and North Carolina and just Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Many of the areas that are humid and mountainous are also very green. And some of the stuff looks like Nova Scotia or perhaps even Old Scotland. And to go along with it having a climate much more reminiscent of places farther north, you do have pretty brutal winters here as well, lots of snow. So if you want to see a little slice of the Appalachians different than most of the rest, well then the Dolly Sods in West Virginia, that's your place. Heading back to the west, I'm going to California and the Carrizo Plain. It's the largest grassland in California and is overall about 386 square miles or 1,000 square kilometers. Just east of the plain, marking the eastern boundary of the plain, is the San Andreas Fault that runs north-south, and then just east of the mountains east of there is the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley. And with it being right there along the fault, there are plenty of spots you can just look into the fault. Look at the open earth right there. And to give you an idea of what an earthquake can do, this is the picture of Wallace Creek. This is a dry creek bed, but an earthquake completely offset the channel. A large part of the Carrizo Plain is Soda Lake. This is a large alkali lake. It's about 5 square miles or about 12 square kilometers, and it has no outflow. And lakes with no outflow are usually very saline, like this one. When it's very dry and the evaporation levels are quite high, a salt crust will form along the rim when the water recedes a little bit. And earlier I talked about the Hoh Rainforest in Washington getting about 130 inches of rain per year. Well, the Carrizo Plain gets about 8 inches of rain per year. But despite this area being so dry, what the Carrizo Plain is most known for are its huge floral superblooms. Photographers will come from all around to get images of this beautiful superbloom. Certainly it can be better in some years than other, but it's always at least pretty good. But my favorite thing about the Carrizo Plain is just how peaceful it is. You can go and sit out on a rock for an hour and not hear anything other than wind. Okay, from the bone-dry west coast to the humid east coast, let's go to the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina. Most of it is in Virginia, and the part there is a national wildlife refuge. The part in North Carolina is largely a state park. The overall swamp is about 750 square miles, which is almost 2,000 square kilometers, so it's a big open wilderness area, big swamp. In 1805, the Dismal Swamp Canal was created to get boating traffic from one end of the swamp to the other much more easily. However, when digging out this canal, that kind of messed up the water flow in the swamp. So you had ditches and berms that are negatively affecting the flow, and it creates stagnant ponds in the swamp. Much of the swamp was drained for logging, and a good chunk of it was basically ruined by industry, but the swamp became protected in 1973. The Dismal Swamp Canal is still being used. It's the oldest continually used canal in the U.S., although it's now used for recreational boaters on the Intracoastal Waterway. It's a popular spot for anglers. There are paddling trails in the water and hiking trails on the dry land. It's a major flyover area for migratory birds. It surprisingly enough has a large black bear population, and I believe it's the northern extent of the range of American alligators. It's always interesting to think of bears and alligators occurring in the same spot, but that is fairly common in many swamps in the southeast. This is the northernmost swamp along the Atlantic coast, and it does get some snow there, so that would be really interesting to see snow in a swamp. So yeah, the Great Dismal Swamp, one of the great named natural areas in the world. Heading right into the middle of the contiguous U.S., we're going to Monument Rocks in Kansas. And these formations are in western Kansas, which is notoriously fairly flat, so these things are kind of like Randy Orton coming from out of nowhere. Now, despite being western Kansas, this isn't the same type Badlands scenery as you get in western Nebraska to the north. By the time you get this far south, you're out of that Badlands geologic region. And these rocks reach up to about 70 feet or 21 meters, and these are fairly tall formations of windows and arches, fairly similar to what you might find in the national parks of Utah, but just at a much smaller scale. However, what these monument rocks are, these are erosional remnants of a larger chalk formation. And this chalk is made up of skeletal and organic debris. And just like Toadstool Geologic Park in western Nebraska, you do have many prehistoric fossils that are found here, including many mammoths. The Monument Rocks area is private property, but the owners do allow people to go on there as long as they're being responsible. There are a few little trails around there, but collecting fossils is definitely prohibited. So if you're doing that drive across western Kansas and you're getting a little bit bored, check out these Monument Rocks. It's a nice break to the scenery. Going a little bit southwest of there, I'm going to Capulin Volcano in New Mexico. This is in the northeast corner of New Mexico, not too far from the Colorado border, and from the rim of the volcano you can see parts of those two states, but also parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And what this is an extinct cinder cone volcano. It stands at about 8,200 feet or about 2,500 meters. And how a cinder cone forms is you think of a larger volcano erupting and many of the debris goes into the air, it comes back down and settles, and it kind of forms into a cone. So you have the different sediments kind of going down the sides there, and you have a crater in the middle of this cone, and that's called the cinder cone. And this volcano last erupted about 60,000 years ago, and again, it's considered extinct, which means it shouldn't erupt again. And this volcano was very prominent in this region because you have a very flat type scenery. It's very similar to eastern Colorado or western Kansas. So when you see this big cinder cone popping out from the plains, it's very noticeable. This area became a national monument in 1916 to protect the mountain and the surrounding grasslands. There are multiple trails at the site. One goes around the base of the volcano and another one goes around the rim at the top of the volcano. The crater itself is about 400 feet or 120 meters deep, and there's another trail that goes halfway down into the crater. And this is one of the easiest volcanoes in the U.S. to get up close and personal with. Getting to the site is really easy, and there's a paved road that spirals its way up to the top. So if you ever wanted to hike a volcano or hike down into the crater of one, well, this might be the very best place to do it in the country. I'm going back east and upstate New York for this one to Whetstone Gulf State Park. This is in the north of the state, but not in the Adirondacks. It's just west of the mountains. The Gulf itself is a 3-mile or 5-kilometer long canyon. At the deepest spot is about 380 feet or 120 meters. And the walls of this gulf are quite steep. It's vertical in many spots. Whetstone Creek is the name of the creek you find at the bottom of the canyon, and that's what carved out this formation. This park is fairly popular for hiking in the summer and also cross-country skiing in the winter. There's about 6 miles or 10 kilometers of trails there. But you're just east of Lake Ontario, and as a result, there's a lot of lake effect snow in this area, about 200 inches of snow or about 5,000 millimeters of snow per year. Many folks visit upstate New York but only visit the Adirondacks, just going to the mountains and lakes, and miss Whetstone Gulf State Park, but don't. This is a really cool spot, something you might not expect in upstate New York. And for the last one I'll mention in this video, I'm going down to west central Georgia and Providence Canyon State Park. The park is about 1,000 acres or about 400 hectares and is referred to as the Little Grand Canyon of Georgia. The deepest part of the canyon is about 150 feet or 45 meters, and some of it is natural. Nature got the ball rolling, but humanity is what made the canyon get to be what it is today. According to the website of the park itself, poor farming practices in the 1800s led to this canyon being what it is today. They didn't really go into more detail than that, but it's probably something to do with how retention of the water wasn't used very well, and some of the rock in the area was eroded much more easily by the water. So there likely would have been a little bit of formation here, maybe a very small canyon, but it certainly wouldn't be like it is today. And normally when you see formations like this, it's going to be sandstone or limestone, but for Providence Canyon, it's mostly clay. And this is located in the coastal plain of the state, so something you certainly wouldn't expect to find in this part of the country. But it's a fairly popular park just south of Columbus, just across the border from Alabama. There's about 7 miles of trails around the rim, and as you see these photos, keep in mind again, this is coastal plain. So it's not quite Cloudland Canyon in northwest Georgia, but Providence Canyon in southwest Georgia is still pretty cool. So that's my look at a handful of natural features and locations in the US, and let me know if you would like me to make this into a series, because there's no shortage of places I can discuss like this. But if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I want to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Zach D. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon page, and the link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.